We have Dr. Cid Martinez here on Slow Motion with Bishop Bowser, and Dr. Martinez is an associate professor at USD. He's in sociology, and I just want to give you a little background on Dr. Martinez to let you know that he is the expert and he can speak on this subject. We're going to be talking about policing today, and we're going to get real deep into it. So, one of the Cid Martinez is author of the book Neighborhood Has Its Own Rules, Latinos and African Americans in South Los Angeles. It was published by the New York University Press, so go out and get that book. Also, the book moves beyond traditional black and white paradigms of urban poverty and violence and introduces a new conceptual framework of understanding how Latinos have transformed the black ghettos based on in-depth ethnography, if I'm saying that right. Martinez introduces the concept of alternative governance to understand how the coexistence of black and brown urban poverty in South Los Angeles shapes how residents respond to some of the most violent neighborhoods in America. The book illustrates some of the most violent neighborhoods in America. The book illustrates how interracial relations between Latinos and blacks, policing, religion, gangs, and local municipal governments shape the way of violence. He's also working on a new book, his newest book manuscript, I should say, tentatively entitled Cops and Clergy, Legitimacy, Trust, and Violence Reduction, builds on previous research by exploring how perceived legitimacy of local clergy can be leveraged by law enforcement to reduce violence. I'm going to skip on down here and share with you some of his areas of expertise. His areas of expertise is in urban poverty, policing, which we'll be talking about today in California, community policing programs, gun violence in California, gang intervention, violence reduction, and trust building. His scholarly work is Martinez research focused on urban politics, policing, gun violence, criminology, religion, immigration, social theory, and interracial relations, with an emphasis on Latinos and African Americans. And so, you know, Dr. Martinez, I've known him for some years now. We go way back since he came to San Diego. I think I bet you right when you came to San Diego. But Dr. Martinez, you know, he's really knee deep into research and study, and especially when we're looking at the violence, gun violence, looking at gangs, and looking at policing. And I've had opportunity to go to some of his classes and speak to his students and so on. So I really appreciate that, allowing me to do that. And so, you know, the thing that I recognize and understand here when we talk about what we're trying to deal with here in policing, I know that you understand this. You know, I mean, you've been teaching on, you've been talking about it with the George Floyd situation, and with dealing with Breonna Taylor, and of course all the shootings and police killings that go way back. You know, and we go back far as you know, Alfred Alongo, and moving on up issues that we're dealing with right here in San Diego. And I know sometimes, you know, with the work that you do, especially when you're doing your research, you know, getting information from the DA's office and some of the police departments and things like that, you have to tread lightly in what you say to do, because you want to be neutral so you can, you know, gather that information and present it to us. And I really appreciate the report that you did. You did issue a report on gun violence and connected with gangs and things like that. I thought that was an excellent report, and really getting a grip and understanding on where guns were coming from. So I appreciate that. And so today we want to talk about policing. You know, a lot of people talking about, you know, reforming this criminal justice system, policing as far as defund the police. Big debate about that. Of course, you know, most Americans don't understand what that means. So even blacks, you know, there's a high percentage of folks that say, no, we don't want the police to be defunded, because they thinking there'll be no more police. And so people don't really understand that concept of defunding the police. But, you know, that a big debate started with that, and looking at how we can change policing. But I think a lot of times people don't really understand the history of policing. You know, we you know, we get it from, oh, there were slave patrols, and that's pretty much as far as most people go when we talk about policing and so on. So I want Dr. Cid Martinez to really break it down. But thank you, Dr. Martinez, for being on Slow Motion with Bishop Bowles and also live streaming on Facebook. Thank you for being with us today.
Thank you for the invitation.
Yes, absolutely. So one of the first things I wanted to ask you is that if you could give us a history on policing and how it connects with modern day policing, because a lot of times people don't really understand the history of policing.
Right. Well, it's a history that goes way back, and it does have its origins in slave patrols. But I would suggest, we also have to look at the formal policing system that developed in New York. It's really in New York where we get the first formal police in America. Mm-hmm. But let's back up a little bit. There was a system known as the Watchman system that existed in the South and in the North. I'm talking about Southern South, slavery South, right, just to be clear. And that system was based on terror and intimidation, as Khalid Muhammad, the historian, has noted. No person would be willing to freely give up their labor without some force. And so that's what people have to remember, that this Watchman system in the South was based on terror. It was based on violence to make sure that slaves who didn't abide by the rules were punished, and it was also meant to make sure that runaway slaves were brought back as well. So that's in the South. That's a Watchman system, but that's not really the first formal policing system that we have in America. As I mentioned earlier, the first police emerged in New York City around the late 1840s. What happened is that America was becoming very urban at this time. This is when America starts to really take off, and as an urban place due to industrialization and due to immigration, which provided the labor.
Right.
So what you had in places like New York is a lot of disorderly conduct. You've got families that are moving from the country. They don't really have a place, for permanent housing. There was no running water. There was no sewage, right? They didn't have any garbage collection.
Wow.
So there was a lot of disorder that disrupted the city. And so New York, at the same time, it's the center of industrialization because of urbanization, and they wanted to get that under control. So they looked to a model that was developed in England and this was probably like in the 1830s, 1840s, a guy by the name of Robert Peel. And the English came up with the model because they had taken over Ireland with the military, and they could not subdue the Irish.
Wow.
The Irish were very tough, stubborn people. They were very resilient. And so the British developed the police. They developed this new entity, and what they told the Irish is they said, we're not here to conquer you or to use violence against you. We're here, this is the key phrase, to provide peace and order. So this was going to be an organization that wasn't necessarily there to conquer people, although it's important to note that that's the origins of modern policing in the world. Right. So people have to remember that when the English developed this was a model intended for the colonial control of the Irish. So that model gets transported to New York. That Watchman system was no longer sufficient. That was the system they had in the South and the North. And the Watchman system wasn't sufficient because it wasn't very organized, and it didn't go after it didn't try to prevent crime. What it did is it went and it apprehended people who were wanted for crimes. There was sort of like the judge would issue a warrant, and then they would go out and find these people. Okay. And they try to provide some perfection of the town. So it wasn't very organized. It wasn't very efficient. And so this is why New York City develops this model of policing from England. Now, a lot of people, they want to know, well, what was the so you've got two things going on here. in the South and in the North, you had this watchman system. And so once you get this system in New York City, then it finds its way down into the South. Remember, the South is not urbanized because of slavery, right? It's still a very kind of rural, agricultural-based economy. And so
did they already have a slave
they don't get. Yeah, well, why would they want to urbanize? They have a slave system, right? And so it was not until later on, later in the 19th century, that they adopt the police system that was developed in New York. And what's important to note, and this is the historian Eric von Koenen, who was at UCLA, he makes this point, and so does another legal scholar by the name of William Stuntz, spelled S-T-U-N-T-Z. These are my citations if people want to look at these works on their own. And essentially what you get in the South is a hybrid. You get this old watchman system based on slavery that becomes fused with the modern police system that emerges in New York. And so in the South, it's a kind of different policing model than you get in the North, because in the South, there was also a kind of informal component to policing meant specifically to regulate black folks, to make sure that they stayed on the plantation and they were following the rules. So that's in the South, policing develops a little differently than in the North because of slavery. And then out here in the West, don't forget this land was taken, originally from Native Americans, but then also Spain had it, and then it becomes part of Mexico. So there's this rich tradition of Native folks, Mexicans, being in this territory. And remember that war with the United States ends around 1846. So now you need a police force to make sure that things are under control out here on the West Coast, in California in particular. So you get a similar kind of system in the West as well. And it has an informal component, just like it did in the South, but here it was meant to keep indigenous folks and Mexicans in their place, right? And the law never really applied to them in the same way. So actually there's three varieties. It turns out that slavery did play an important role in producing the policing system in the South. But I also think that people need to note that New York model is really the origins of modern policing, and we shouldn't lose sight of that either. I know a lot of people talk about slave patrols. That's true. That is factually correct. But what I'm suggesting here is we also need to pay attention to the New York model, because it's this paramilitary organization, right? And you don't get this paramilitary organization until you get that model in New York. And two other things I want to mention about the police system in New York that's very relevant to today. And I think this is why a lot of people are pushing for defund the police, and you have some people that are pushing for police abolition. There's a big debate about what the purpose of policing in New York was about. But again, going back to the work of Eric von Koenen, he says that police essentially did two things. One, they were there to protect property, right? That part of their role was to keep the city moving along so that business could continue. But he also says they were also meant to deal with the needs of the working class and the poor as well, right? So it wasn't just interest, but the big takeaway from his work is that fundamentally emerged in New York to deal with what was known as the dangerous class. And the dangerous class were working class people, mostly European immigrants, right? And their job was to keep these people in place and from disrupting and creating disorder.
Now, when you say these people,
so,
I know there's various groups of people. What people you're specifically speaking about when you say these people?
Yeah, so here in New York, I'm mostly talking about European immigrants who were working class,
like the Irish, German, Polish.
Yeah, exactly.
Okay,
exactly. But They were also meant, don't forget that there were fugitive slave laws, and in many instances, slaves they were runaway slaves, and they would go up to the north and try to escape.
Right.
And in some instances, there's another good book I recommend folks take a look at. It's called Slave Patrols.
Okay.
It's published by Harvard University Press. I forget the name of the author, but it's called Slave Patrols. And in that book, the author makes the point that in some instances, the police in New York cooperated with Southerners, but in many instances, they didn't. So it's hard to know what exactly was going on. But here's the main point I wanted to make.
Okay.
So we can reduce policing really down to two major points. One, controlling, protecting property, and number two, controlling the dangerous class. And I would argue that that dangerous class grew to include black folks who, when slavery ended, go into the cities, right?
Right, the migration, great migration.
Yes. So the conclusion of this is that not only were police designed to protect property, they were originally intended to maintain the class and racial hierarchy in America.
All right.
To maintain it. And when you get to some of the recent works by Khalid Muhammad, which you and I have discussed, he has a book that I highly recommend folks take a look at. It's called The Condemnation of Blackness. And in that book, I mean, that's kind of where he takes off in his work. And basically, one of the things he shows is that for most of the 20th century, that's exactly what the police did. What their primary function was to maintain this kind of racial hierarchy in America and made sure that people didn't go out of what was acceptable. So segregation, for example, right? Making sure that black folks out here on the West Coast, Latino folks, didn't go into white neighborhoods, didn't venture into those neighborhoods, that they stayed in their own schools, they stayed in their own communities. And I think this is why we're at this moment now, because I think people are asking themselves, given the history and the origins of American policing, is this what we want? Do we want a system that inherently is designed to protect property and to maintain the racial and class hierarchy in America? And I think that's why we're at this moment now in this post-George Floyd era, where people are now seriously considering defund the police, which can be viewed as a reform movement. There are some people that don't want to get rid of the police, but they want to defund the police. And then you have another strain of thought, and these are the people that I would refer to as the abolitionists. And the abolitionists, they want them gone all the way. And so I think it's important to, when we see people out in the streets, to try to figure out where people fall. Are some of the activists simply pushing for reform when they ask for defund the police, or are we looking at people that want abolition? So that's kind of my short. I don't know how short it was.
I know.
That's my brief summary of policing in America.
That's very good, and you broke it down, especially because that was one of my questions: the difference between North policing and South policing, and you really broke that down, and how, like in the South, policing was about social control of blacks, right, and enforcing that slave system. In the North, they sometimes participated and helped the slave patrols in the South, and sometimes they didn't. But one of the things that they did do in the North with police is protect property and that racial class protection, right? Like, so they had ethnics. It was I guess it was broken down by ethnics, because you had whites, but they had this ethnic breakdown. You had the white Americans, but then you had Irish and Germans and Poland, and I believe there were some other groups that they kind of like held as a second class or pushed into what we would call the ghettos, and the things that you were talking about did have all of that. When did it get to a place to where that, after slavery, we go through all the, the Reconstruction and the Black Code and all those different things, and we get into the 20s, we get into the 30s, the teens, and to the 20s and the 30s and things like that. When did it get to a place to where that the focus was no longer on racial control of white ethnic groups, and it basically grew to blacks and Latinos, because Latinos went through a lot also, especially in 2030s and 40s and so on. So when did it get to the place where they were trying to do that social control and policing really harshly on black bodies and brown bodies?
Yeah. So, white, even when we think of white, what it means to be white in America, that was a gradual progression, right? I mean, this is why even when you go to parts of New York or on the East Coast, you still have these neighborhoods broken down, right, by ethnicity, right? So whiteness as a concept is evolving, and not everybody was considered white. Irish for sure. I mean, they referred to them as dogs. Italians were sort of looked down upon, but they eventually evolved into modern whiteness. So one of the things that's different for black folks, and I would argue for Latinos, right, is that we never really evolved into that category, and that's certainly true for black folks. So one of the things that, again, I'll go back to Khalid Muhammad's work in the condemnation of blackness. There was a big debate about what the role of black folks should be in America. Many people, after the Civil War, didn't want to completely integrate them, right? This is why we have the 14th Amendment, because after the Civil War's over, you had a lot of Southern folks who refused to recognize black folks as citizens. Right. So the federal government sends in the Freedmen's Bureau, which worked to some extent for they were only operational. They weren't operational for more than 2 years. W.E. Du Bois talks about this in The Souls of Black Folks. But still, the Freedmen's Bureau leaves the South. Black folks are led. They're sort of left on their own to fend for themselves after the Freedmen's Bureau leaves. The federal government's gone. They take the military with them. And so these former slave owners and people that benefited tried to force black folks back on the plantations into something like sharecropping systems, right? So blackness was always a question that was up for debate in America, and it continues to be. Right. And so one of the things that Muhammad argues in his book is that blackness could have been associated with different things, but the overriding category that ends up defining black folks, according to Muhammad, and I think he's right, is being dangerous.
Well, yeah.
Being dangerous and being criminal oriented as a result.
And still doing it today.
This became, and that couldn't be more true than today, right? And so as a result, Muhammad argues this was the primary role of the police. The primary role of the police, given this identity, was to make sure that black folks stayed in these segregated neighborhoods, right? In places like if you're in LA, in South LA, right? In West Fresno, in East Oakland.
Keep talking.
If you're in Chicago, in South side of Chicago, so that was the primary purpose of policing. So for black folks, there never was an integration into the category, into assimilation. Right. And I would argue it's actually true for Latinos too. I just gave another interview recently and we were talking about this. And why it's different for Latinos is a lot of people say, well, black folks, they didn't choose to immigrate. They didn't. They came here because of slavery. And it's the same thing to some extent for Latinos. We did not immigrate here, right? There's an old saying that we have, we didn't cross the border crossed us.
Exactly.
Right? And so because of that history, which is a colonial history, a lot of people argue that this is what the police continue to do. The police continue to view black folks and Latinos as colonial subjects. And it's not unreasonable to think that this is just an extension of what we saw in American history 100 years ago, right? Right. I think we're at a defining moment where there's an awareness building. This kind of hyper policing really takes off in the 20th century, and this is what Jim Crow was all about. Jim Crow would not have been possible without the police.
Amen.
Right?
Amen.
And so one of the things Muhammad argues in that book is it's not that ghettos were created and then the police went to patrol and made sure that folks stayed in the ghettos. He's implying that without the police, you don't get ghettos. You need police to form ghettos to make sure that people stay in their place, because of this racial hierarchy that we have in America.
Wow, that's crazy, and that's what I call social control. They're trying. That's one of the main things, because everything's built around the economics and what they're trying to do, and so on. So let me ask you another question: is because one of the things that we deal with, especially with some of the work we're doing today, to end pretext stops, which end up in kind of like with New York with stop and frisk, but here we call it pretext stops, racial profiling, where police will stop you. And because of a taillight out, but ultimately they're using that to really investigate you, because they see like a black person, and like you said, they're criminals, they're dangerous, so they up to something. So let's stop and investigate and see what we can find out, see what we can get. We're gonna find a gun, some drugs, or something, right? And so they pull you over, and then they want to search you, right? But this has a history. This stop and frisk has a history. It just didn't start in New York. It didn't start today, or even when the Terry stops in the 60s and the Wren decision in the 90s, with the Supreme Court decisions they're making on that they can do pretext stops and they can search you. In the 69, I think it was, with the Terry stops, 69, 68, Supreme Court ruled that they can, if they're suspicious, have reasonable suspicion, they can search you, and then Wren made an order that they can use pretext stops even if you have some type of equipment violation or whatever, they can stop you if it's a legitimate stop and use that as a pretext to investigate something else. But it didn't even begin in the 60s or in the 90s when these laws, the Supreme Court made these rulings. When can you say that this stop and frisk began, and who was it used on, and what was the objective of that?
Yeah, so some people argue that stop and frisk actually can be traced back to LAPD, going back into the 50s, 40s, and it really emerges. There was a guy by the name of Volmer, spelled Volmer.
Okay.
And
I heard the name.
He was an important person. He was from Berkeley. But he really tried to professionalize policing. So there was a movement.
That's where I heard him from. Yes.
In the middle of the 20th century, earlier than the 1950s, going back to the 1950s, 1940s, to professionalize policing. And one of the things that Volmer and other folks who really tried to champion this idea of the professionalization of policing was to produce preventative policing. So instead of just catching people, right, they wanted to prevent crime.
Right.
So what they did, the way the tactic sort of emerged in LA, and I think Volmer kind of helped popularize this tactic as well, as a way to prevent crime. If there was a crime scene, or somebody there was a crime committed, what the police would do is they would flood the area with officers, and then they would just interrogate whoever they could in that particular area. That was kind of the original idea of it, and to just cast a wide net on a targeted area, and usually where those targeted areas were, if we're talking about LA, right, those were mostly in Black and Latino neighborhoods, right? You weren't seeing a lot of that in the middle class or more affluent parts
of they were there to protect them.
LA. Right. So I think to answer your question, this idea of stop and frisk, it was popularized in the 1990s by a guy by the name of William Bratton, who became chief of police in New York City.
I heard of him.
Under Giuliani. His name seems to be coming up a lot lately. When Giuliani was mayor of New York, that's where it gets popular. But the origins of it go back earlier into the earlier, the latter third of the 20th century, and some people suggest that LAPD and this guy that I referred to, if anybody wants to do more research on the origins of professional policing, take a look at this guy named Volmer, Volmer, and it was an attempt again to prevent crime. And how do you prevent crime? You try to interrogate people before they commit a crime, right? And who is more likely to be considered a criminal because of the way earlier we talked about the way in which race was constructed for black folks, right? Black folks were the ones that were viewed as being more dangerous, and in LA, obviously Latinos as well.
Right. And you know, it's amazing when I hear you talk about that, because you know, when you look at prohibition, right, and you know, everybody, you know, was somehow, some way benefiting from prohibition and dealing with the liquor, you know, illegal liquor and so on and so forth. And they could not control it. That's why they passed the amendment, made an amendment, you know, to make it back legal. But it was a lot of crime going on back then among, you know, whether it's Italians, Irish, you know, other different ethnic white groups and things like that were really like killing folks and doing these drive-by shootings and so on. But one of the things that at least from what I've heard, is in looking at this, is that the judges and the police kind of like was corrupt, worked along with them, right? You know, when it came to that, but it seemed like it shifted, you know, that looking at them as gangsters and so on. So now, when do you think the shift took place as far as from the focus on the gangsters, and of course we know the FBI and always focus on mafia and different people like that, but where it really begin to criminalize, you know, the black and brown communities versus on the other end, all these other folks that still continue to commit crimes, but the most dangerous people are black people and criminals, you know, and that's where the focus always seems to be, even though everyone is selling drugs, everyone is committing crimes, everyone's doing robberies and so on, but the focus seems to be this person, because of the color of your skin, you're the criminal and you're dangerous.
Well, I mean, it's a good point. A lot of people don't realize that policing was extremely corrupt up until probably the 1950s in America. And in most of the cities in New York, in Chicago, these cities that had machine politics, right? This is where you had a ward boss, and they would get people jobs, and in return, people would vote for these political candidates who were getting them jobs. But a lot of these bosses had a lot of money, and they bribed a lot of people, right? This is the history of most big cities in America. The odd thing is that in LA, there were no machines. This is what's really odd about it. And so it was very corrupt. So it's not until the 1950s, which is, I think, is around the time when you really start to see stop and frisk developing even more, right? Because that's the time when William Parker, during the 1950s, becomes chief of police in LA. And everybody's heard that name if you're from LA. And his main thing was to root out corruption. And what he told his officers is, you can do whatever you want, but I don't want to see people on the take. A lot of that's rhetoric. I'm sure there was still a lot of corruption.
And didn't he recruit a lot of people from the sorry, I just want to interject and ask a question. Didn't he hire a lot of folks from the South to come and police in LA during that time?
He did, and he hired a lot of people from the military as well.
Ah, look at that.
Because he wanted to be very professionalized. So that kind of, you know, reaffirmed some of those racist ideas. You had people coming from the South, you know, they're mostly white folks, and then you hire these people from the military, right? And so you get that kind of military culture as well. Yeah, absolutely. Go ahead. I'm sorry. Question. I think there's. Yeah, go ahead.
No, go ahead. Go ahead. I think you froze up a little bit. Go ahead.
Okay. Yeah. No. What I was going to say is that I think you start to see more aggressive policing as the size of the black population grows in urban America. Right. Don't forget that it was during the Great Migration after World War II when you get this mass exodus of black folks coming into urban America.
Right.
At the same time that police departments are becoming professionalized and trying to prevent crime. And so this is when policing, to go back to what I said at the beginning of our discussion, right? What is their job? What is their primary job? Their primary job, one of their primary jobs is to maintain the racial and class structure in America. And so if that meant that black folks were coming into cities in large numbers, which they were after the Great Migration, then that meant that they had to be more aggressive. So I think the professionalization of policing, but also the influx of black folks coming out of the South into big cities, even here in California, right?
Right.
LA doesn't become a fully developed, or South LA doesn't become a fully developed ghetto until the 1960s. That's what some people would argue. And a lot of that were these waves of migration out of the South into LA. And then, right, we know what happens in the 1960s in places like Watts, right? Then you see this kind of explosion of activity. So a lot of it had to do with the influx, more black folks in urban America, the professionalization of policing, which I would argue made them even sort of more aggressive because of their attempt to try to prevent crime. And by preventing crime, that meant using tactics like stop and frisk that were already well in play in LA before we even get to New York. And I'm glad you brought that up. Because people tend to overgeneralize stop and frisk as if it only existed in New York, right? There's a long history of it in LA, in California before it became popularized.
Yeah, absolutely. So the other question I have for you is, when we talk about the criminal justice system, when was that concept developed? You know, when you start, like, you know, it's new now. And I know, like, I know the conversations already were beginning before Michelle Alexander, when she wrote her book, you know, The New Jim Crow. But, you know, when she talked about that, and of course, California, when they got sued, they had the courts ordered them to do reform. And so I know, you're talking about the 2000s, we started hearing about this reform, because before it was tough on crime, lock everybody up. Now people are talking about criminal justice reform, but this is, to my understanding, not a new concept, right? And so when we talk about criminal justice reform, when did that concept come into existence, or started being developed? When did it start?
Well, I mean, I think, it's been something, I think, that has been going on in the Black and Latino community for most of the 20th century. I don't think it's an entirely new thing, right? I mean, in the 1950s, in the 1960s, right? Think about the civil unrest in America, and so I think if we're talking about criminal justice reform and policing, the 1960s, I think, were the time where we really start to see these ideas developing. This is where the Black Panthers developed the 10-point plan. And so this idea of police abolition, I was telling my students, it's not a new idea.
That's right.
It's not a new idea. People in the Black Panthers were talking about this. Angela Davis has been talking about this. And there were attempts by communities to police the police.
Right.
There was a program called the CAP program. I forget what the acronym was, but this, like Watts, in places in Oakland, and their whole thing was to police the police. So you see a lot of these ideas from the Black Panthers. You see a lot of these ideas even coming from people that were arguing against racism. I think there was a term, I'm trying to think of the term for not the Third World Movement, right? Was trying to push for justice and equality as well. but there were I think in the 1960s, when you look at what the civil rights movement was about, when you look at what the Black Panthers were doing, I think this is when a lot of the ideas that we're confronting now emerge.
So, and understanding and looking at that, you know, I just have, unless you have something else, I just have one more question, but it's kind of like a twofold question, two-part question, is that, you know, when you talk about the police and bringing it to modern day, we understand, look at the history of it and see, and so we can see how we got to where we are now, you know, and especially with the crime bill of, what was that, 94, 95, somewhere around there, the Bill Clinton crime bill, and that just escalated things, you know, to a whole nother level, bringing all type of resources for police to hire, to train, and so on. I was talking with a chief of police, and he out here, and he was telling me when he started force, that's when that crime bill passed, that's when he got on the force, and he was told, you know, hey, just get out and arrest many people you can and put them in prison. Fill the prisons. And that was the objective, because there's money to build prisons, money for police, money for them to get trained, and so on. So when we talk about criminal justice reform, how do, first part of the question is, can the police fix themselves, right? Because most of the time they always want to be at the table or guide the conversation, or they'll say they let the community guide it, but they still like there. They always use things like, you know, like I'm just using this as example, the CRB, Citizens Review Board or Community Review Boards, the review boards. They say, oh, that should be people with law enforcement background, right? Because they always feel like they're the ones, you know, that have the expertise to do what needs to be done, whether it's investigation, whether it's fixing the system. So the first part of the question is, can the police fix themselves, right? Can they fix themselves? And then the second part of the question is that what I see standing in the way of criminal justice reform, or reforming police, I should say, is these police unions. And how did they become so powerful, you know? And at one time, police, from what I heard, is that they were used to bust up the unions, right? And now they have a union. What do you think about that? What are your thoughts on that?
Yeah, in terms of can the police themselves, I think the answer to that one's pretty clear. That what most people are really upset about, you know, why we're in this moment now, since the death of George Floyd, is accountability. Right. And accountability for misconduct is a problem.
Right.
It's a problem because the law allows police officers to use force in a way that most of the time is going to be justified, and it's the law, right? And they understand that, and so you know, they have this thing called qualified immunity, which basically gives the police the right to use force if they feel that their life is threatened, and if it's something that is typically done, that most officers use if force is used typically in those kinds of situations. So you need public input. There's no way that the police are going to. They have shown us. We've been talking about reform. People have been asking for these issues to be resolved, and history has taught us that the police are not able to police themselves. Right?
And what about these unions?
And they're funded by the public. They're funded by the public. So the public should have more input in determining what happens, right? And the way the system is developed, and it's not an accident, by the way.
Right.
There's a great book by a guy by the name of Fogelson, spelled Fogelson. It's called Big City Police.
Okay.
And basically, what he argues in that book is that because cities were so worried about the corruption from the machines that I described earlier, these European ethnics, right? The Irish and the Italians, who were working class people, because police departments were so corrupt, they wanted to make sure that the public had very little influence on the police. So they created this bureaucracy basically that was impenetrable to the public, and so that the public would have very little influence because of this fear that they were going to be controlled. Well, now we have another problem, and that is, now there aren't enough outlets and ways to have meaningful participation with the police.
Right.
So I would argue that because of the accountability issue and because of the few channels that are open to the public that really have disciplinary power, that there's no way that the police can police themselves.
Right. And these unions, how did they become so powerful? Is it their lobbying ability, and when they first start forming these unions? Because at one time, police was used to bust up unions.
Right. So going back to what I mentioned earlier, right? So beginning in the 1950s and 60s, when police become more professional, this is the time when unions start to take off in the 1960s. And little by little, as the city bureaucracies have increased, police departments, especially in places like California, have found ways to grow the power of their union, especially the more they felt like they're under attack. The more that the police departments feel they're under attack, the more they feel like they needed to strategize. So I'd say probably since the 1960s that they've done this. And there's at least, there's multiple ways in which they were able to grow and how they're able to influence people. One of the ways that they're able to influence what happens is through their from the dues that they get from their members. They were able to contribute to elected people who are running for office, elected officials. So if you want to win, if you're running for city council or you're running for any municipal position, getting that police endorsement is important for two reasons. One, it shows you're not soft on crime, right? Because the police are backing you. And number two, you're going to get that money for your campaign. So those two things, I think, end up being a very powerful force for people running for positions like city council, but they can also be very influential for races like the district attorney, who is usually the one responsible for examining police misconduct. Right. So, give you an example of how this works. In Sacramento, there were a lot of community activists who were very upset because the DA that was reviewing the police-involved killing of Stephon Clark, that was a high-profile police-involved killing, it turns out that the DA had received a significant amount of money from the police department, from the same police department that she's investigating, right? So a lot of people thought, well, that's a conflict of interest because she's taken all this money from the police department. How can we expect her to be fair or impartial? So I think that's the first thing that makes the unions powerful. The LA Times ran a really good article, I think back in September, on this issue. And they wrote actually a more recent one, and they said a lot of the police reform bills that are being proposed have been essentially stopped in their tracks because of the police union in California. And which I thought is really interesting, kind of speaks to your point. And in this article, they highlighted a couple of points. One of them was the contracts that union members get. So if you make these, if the state of California was to enact or pass some of the bills calling for police accountability, or even defunding the police, which is what people are asking for, that would be very problematic. And it's problematic because these officers and these departments have written into their contracts they will be paid X amount of money, right, over X number of years. So how are you going to defund the police when local government has already agreed to these police contracts that are guaranteed in writing? You see what I'm saying?
Mm-hmm.
So that's a second factor that would affect defund the police. And then I think the third factor that's a problem is the Police Bill of Rights. I don't know all the details of the Police Bill of Rights, but
Right.
one of the things it says is that there was a lot of restrictions in terms of how they can be investigated for police misconduct.
Right.
Which also puts limits. So essentially, what these unions have done is they found a way to influence local politics, and this is why looking at that New York model is so important, because the New York model of policing is based on municipal city government. We're talking about municipal budgets here and municipal elected.
What happened? Hold on. Look like I lost him. Did I lose you? Hold on. It looked like I lost Dr. Martinez. There you are. Hey, I lost you. I think I lost you for a minute there. I should have put my. I think somebody's trying to call me, and it blocked. It blinked you out.
So, that's okay.
But say what you were saying.
Yeah. So I was talking about the second thing about the contracts, and how those union contracts basically guarantee a certain amount of money, and those contracts also can protect officers from being investigated as well. So I think what we're finding here in California, and I would encourage everyone to look at the LA Times article. I think the title of it is, I can actually give you the title of it here. It's Police Reform Advocates Scrutinize Police Unions, Calling Them Obstacles to Reform. And this article came out fairly recent, but it really shows the power of police unions and how they are probably currently one of the biggest obstacles to any serious reform.
Right. So and just some final thoughts here, from you in regards to, before we close out, with all the talking about reforming the police, accountability, and things like that. I think that there's different aspects of when you're talking about dealing with policing, and everybody is like looking at it from one lens. And let me give you an example. There are some people just thinking like, with the mayor's race, Barbara Bree and Todd Gloria, they both talking about, oh, well, I support the CRB, the new Measure B. I support that, right? And they think that that's reform, right? And then Bob Bree add, oh, community-oriented policing. But they're forgetting about, on the front end, all what we just talked about, what police is there for, right? And how they use the police to oppress, communities of color, especially black and brown, right? In what we deal with, and we know that has been the target all the time: criminalization of the community, of a race, of group of people, and then you oppress them, and then when you go to jail and go to prison, things like that. Now you got a record. It makes it more difficult to rebuild your life, after you get out. And so it's that social control, which Michelle Alexander talked about. So my thing is that we have to look at it from a not just one lens, but a comprehensible whole. We have to yes, we need CRB accountability. Yes, we need transparency. Yes, we need compassion policing in the community. But also they have to change the culture within policing, and in what we was talking about, the stop and frisk, and that first, they are the first responders to mass incarceration, right? So we got to get in front of that. What are your thoughts on that, and how can what should we be addressing?
Again, I'm going to come back to this point of accountability, right?
Mm-hmm.
I mean, what kind of power does the CRB really have? Are they able to somehow influence the disciplinary action of officers?
Mm-hmm.
And as you know, the past has shown us that lots of these organizations are very weak in terms of the power that they're given, especially if they're headed up by the city.
That's right.
And then in terms of community-oriented policing, I've been doing a lot of research on this.
Mm-hmm.
This is one of the good things about teaching on this subject.
I know you teach on it all the time.
It turns out that there's very little evidence that community policing works.
Thank you, doctor.
And part of the problem was that you have all these police departments enacting what they call community policing, and nobody really knows A, what community means,
right,
and B, even though the federal government gives these grants out for these, I guess the name of the program that the federal government has, it's COPS, Community-Oriented Policing Strategies or something like that. But the federal government has never identified a standard model that has been evaluated and tested that works. So when people use that term, community-oriented policing means 1,000 different things to 1,000 different people, and it turns out there's very little evidence that these programs work.
Look at that.
And then just one other thought. I could really go off on this topic, but community-oriented. Let's suppose we did have a form of community policing that does work. Okay, let's just imagine that.
Right.
The problem is that the police department is a complex bureaucracy.
Right.
And it has all these different units. It's got the gang enforcement team. It's got the crime suppression unit, right? It's got regular patrol. And so while this community policing program maybe is able to do some good, that's not the only unit that residents come into contact with, right? They come into contact with that gang suppression team or with that other suppression-oriented team, or they got to deal with probation. So one unit ends up being just one small piece of the police bureaucracy and one small piece of a policing agency or unit that people are going to come into contact. That's not going to define their relationship. It's going to be that gang suppression team, right? It's going to be that regular patrol guy that they have interactions with. And so that's very problematic. And I think a lot of people are looking to community policing as a panacea, and the evidence just isn't there.
Thank you.
It works.
Thank you. So what do you think we need to do? As far as if we're talking about reforming police and to end, these hostile contacts where people are being shot and killed and arrested. See, I like Minister Muhammad, Mosque 8, one of the things he said to me several years ago is that, for every black person that gets killed, there are thousands that's being locked up, right? And we tend to forget that. We tend to forget how many families are being destroyed through the mass incarceration. And of course, these contacts, which create trauma, they create a lot of forces used on them, use of force used on them. And sometimes, people die, right? Get killed. And overwhelmingly, when it comes to blacks being killed by police and things like that, how do we fix that? How do we address that and change that?
Well, just two thoughts come to mind. One, this is why I think your work, the kind of work you were doing before with CAST, is so important. We have to start.
I'm back with CAST,
invest. So. Okay, I wasn't sure whether to mention that, but I think there are lots of alternatives to the police, and organizations like CAST, organizations like Advanced Peace.
Yeah.
You had the opportunity to meet one of the leaders. You and I sat down with that brother for a couple of hours, and we talked about his work. Their program has been evaluated, and it's been shown to work. Yeah. And this isn't the prevention. This is gun violence intervention, right? The kind of work that you do and that they're doing. So it turns out there's a whole host of neighborhood, community-based alternatives, nonprofits. For example, have played a huge role in this. And so I think investing more in them would be a viable alternative, and they work. They've been evaluated. Yep. It's not just, people don't know what to do. That's a concrete policy recommendation that I'm providing that works and can put a dent in serious violent crime like gun violence. That's number one. Number two, we have another problem now.
Mm-hmm.
We're entering another period of policing that I think is very troubling, and I didn't see this until I had the opportunity to spend a lot of time with some of the gang enforcement teams up north in Sacramento.
Uh-huh.
You have a huge number of black and brown men that are now coming out of jail. Now we're dealing with the effects of de-incarceration.
Right.
Now, so it's not just the ones going to jail, and when they come back,
mm-hmm.
when our people are coming back, now you're on parole, you're maybe a fourth waiver, and if you thought stop and frisk was a problem,
mm-hmm.
right? When you don't have your Fourth Amendment right,
mm-hmm.
and an officer can pull you over for just looking at them when you're out on the streets, right?
Right.
You're gonna continue to be surveilled, even though you're not in jail, and so are your family members. And because there are so many people coming out of jail now, and then you have these parole and probation surveillance or organizations, right? Officials,
mm-hmm.
they're now working increasingly with law enforcement, and they're surveilling, patrolling, pulling people over. This is beyond stop and frisk now.
Exactly.
Right?
Exactly.
And the scary thing is, and this is what I tell people, it's legal.
Yep.
It's legal
Yep.
because morally it doesn't feel right. It's wrong, right?
Right.
But technically it's legal because you have all these young men coming out and they're on parole and they have no rights at all.
Man.
They are subject to whatever the officer feels like he wants to do.
Right.
That's for me, that's the big problem we're confronting now. So we're going to have to find a way to start addressing the way in which black and brown men are being policed during their post-release time back into the community, because that's what the state and federal government want us to do now. A, they can't afford to keep locking people over.
Right.
B, it sounds like they're being progressive. We're going to let you people go. And then when they come back to the community, they're policed like we haven't seen before.
And then not only that, but they are when they get folks to make plea deals, right? To plead to a felony, we'll let you go right now. You know, they might have been in jail for a couple of months or whatever, going to court. We'll let you go. You know, but plead to a felony, and so then they're on that system too. So one of the things that we have, and I'll close with this, unless you have some final words. Is that we have an ordinance we're trying to get passed with the city of San Diego called PROTECT, Preventing Over-Policing Through Equitable Community Treatment, right? And that deals with black, brown, it deals with mentally disabled folks, and it deals with LGBTQ community, because all these groups are targeted by the police. And so what we're trying to do is end that. So what PROTECT does is, number one, is that you can't stop someone unless you have probable cause to stop a person, right? You can't use a pretext stop. You tell lies how we just investigate. No, they have to be a probable cause. Like there was a robbery and the guy was in this kind of car and there was a person that had a beanie with, and it fit that description. So that's a probable cause to pull that person over or stop that person, right? We know they lie a lot of times, even when it comes to probable cause. But that's number one. And then number two is that with having probable cause, this includes the fourth waivers, right? People on parole and probation, so that what we're saying is even people that are fourth waivers, you shouldn't be pulling them over unless there's a probable cause, there's a reason to do it. Not just, oh, I see Dustin, he's on probation, let's stop him, right? Because that's what they do. No, we want to end that. And what we also want to end is that just because you see somebody that may be documented as a gang member, that's not probable cause just because you have him documented, which may, be falsely documented or whatever, because we know how the Cal gang database is. And then not only that, but no more consent searches, right? You need you need probable cause to search also, not just to stop, but probable cause to search also. And so what we believe in implementing this, and then also fining the police department if they violate this ordinance, right? Whether it's $1,000 or whatever we have to do to the individual that, was stopped. You wasted his time and her time or what have you. People lose their jobs sometimes because they're always being stopped by the police, being late to work, or having handcuffs put on them and the whole shebang. So we want to end that, and I believe that, that'll deal with that on the front end of, at least from the perspective of email, at least from the perspective of dealing with this stop and frisk and how they police the community and treat the police and things. And then it also, I believe, will limit, how they police the community from the perspective how they police, like you say, the white class, right? Because they use drugs just as much as, black and brown folks use drugs, but yet black people are overwhelmingly arrested for drugs. So I really, I think that, ordinances like that, but when you bring that to the mayors, both of them, that the candidates for mayors, they don't want to touch it with a 10-foot pole, right? They say, oh, well, we support CRB. Oh, well, we're going to demilitarize this and all. Oh, those things sound good, but it's really not like what you just brought up. The data doesn't support what they're talking about in the sense of you're going to bring true reform and make an impact in the community where you build trust, where people trust you, where they say, yes, we have how do they term it? We have a lovely relationship with the police, right? When black and brown folks say that, yeah, I trust them they trust them just as much as white people trust them and believe in them just as much as white people believe in them. Then you made progress. And you're not going to make progress by simply some of the things that they're talking about, because a lot of that stuff is on the back end. And even when you talk about community-oriented policing, there's no data really to support like what really works in that, right? So they use that and throw that term out there. And there are some cities where that have changed, but I think when they changed to use community policing, they changed the culture too, right? They stopped criminalizing the community and stopped treating folks as dangerous and as criminals, but they treat them with decency and respect and so on, and implementing that procedural justice. So that was my final thoughts on it. If you have any final thoughts before we close out, you're free to do it at this time.
No, I just want to thank you for having me on. It's always a pleasure to talk with you and discuss these issues.
Yeah, and thank you for being on the show with us, and I really appreciate it. Anytime I call on you for help, whether it's a radio show or a podcast or a lot of times I just call you to pick your brain. You're always there. You always give me resources, send me a lot of information to read and books to read and things like that, and so on. So I really appreciate it because it's always important. Because I was listening to you when you was talking about advanced peace and talking about, and I thank you for letting me meet with the brother, and then I was able to call him and talk with him and get some other information because some things I want to implement in San Diego from what they're doing because it worked, right? And I really appreciate those type of connections and the kind of work we do. But even in that work, like we did with Cass, what your role is very important also in the research, the data, and all of that. So appreciate everything you do. And always, look forward to working together in the future in the things that we do and so on. I want you to hold on. We're going to stop. We thank everybody for being on our podcast, Shaphat Outreach Podcast, Slow Motion with Bishop Bowser. And this is the end of episode 13. And we'll see you on you'll hear from us on episode 14. God bless you. And hold on, Doctor. I'm going to close this out because I want to talk to you.